well-known writer. She's traveled the world talking about the illness of alcoholism. And her present official title is Founder and Consultant of the National Council on Alcoholism. But tonight, I would like to introduce her as the first lady member of Alcoholics Anonymous. Marty?
You've got enough machinery here. What are you doing, recording it? I will always remember the first time I gave an AA talk in San Francisco. Since I've been introduced, I don't need to say my name is Marty and I'm an alcoholic. But I want you all to know I have a right to be here. I earned my way to this platform. It wasn't handed to me on a silver platter. But I'm reminded by those of the first time that I talked at an AA meeting in San Francisco. It was in, I think, 1946, 45 or 46. We didn't have tape recorders then, and I hadn't realized it, but they recorded my talk. Well, these were the early days of the National Council, and I was traveling all over the country trying to teach people that alcoholism was a disease and no one should be ashamed of having it and that they could get well. And because we had so little money, I didn't go somewhere and then come home. I arranged a trip which amounted to one-night stand, so I just kept going. And I'd been on the road for a couple of months, and that's a little tiring. And I've discovered something about myself as a speaker. I never use notes, and I'm able to think on my feet, but the tireder I get, the less selective I get. So if I'm really tired, I talk forever. And that's what happened that night. Somebody told me afterwards I had talked for an hour and 40 minutes, and it was all recorded. And when it came out on records, that was before LP, there were 8 records. And I became known to my friends as Mrs. 16 Sides. Well, you know, it's pretty good having AA friends because they make certain that your ego doesn't get away from you. They go around with pin cushions full of pins, which they stick in you at appropriate moments, and thank God they do. It keeps you comfortable. Tonight, when we were sitting outside and I was having a cup of coffee before we came in, I said to Paul, "What do you want me to talk about?" I've been around AA long enough now and thought about it enough so that there are an awful lot of things you could talk about AA and about alcoholism and about us at an AA meeting. And Paul said, "Gee, I'd like you to tell your whole story." Well, I want you to know it wouldn't be Mrs. 16 Sides, it would be Mrs. 116 Sides if I did that. So I'm not quite going to do that, Paul. I am, however, going to make perfectly clear to those of you who don't know me and who may not have heard me before that I have a right to be right here where I am. That I have a right to be a member of AA, that I paid my initiation fee and it was damned high, and that I'm a bona fide alcoholic, not masquerading about it. I'm told that occasionally people come into AA as part of their social climate. They want to meet all the nice people here. Well, I didn't. But I'd like to skip over this fairly lightly, just start out by saying that when I began to drink, I was about 17, I think. I had that experience that I think so many of us had, if we look back, if we remember, honestly, I discovered magic. A drink or two did everything I needed. I was shy. I always felt a little uncomfortable in a group. I was beginning to meet a whole lot of people beyond the little group I'd grown up with. And I was often tongue-tied. And I discovered that with a couple of drinks, that didn't happen. I was perfectly at ease and perfectly comfortable and just having a bowl. Well, it wasn't very long before I found that a couple of drinks didn't do it. I needed quite a lot. That was about the time I discovered my capacity, and it was terrific. I was a most expensive date. And this was in Prohibition, when getting it wasn't easy, but you didn't go out with anybody that didn't have a flask. And it soon became apparent, and everybody was telling me, that I could drink more than anybody else. I could drink an awful lot without showing it, drive the car home perfectly well, remember everything that happened, and that wasn't true of everybody. Well, you know, that was something to be proud of. Everyone sort of patted you on the back about it, and you felt pretty good about it, too. But none of us knew that actually that is one of the earliest symptoms of alcoholism, because that isn't normal drinking. I also had been in AA quite a while before it dawned on me that if I had gained the reputation of being able to drink more than anybody else, well, I must have been drinking more than anybody else. And that's what I did from the very beginning, and for 10 years it was just lovely. I didn't have any difficulties or any problems. Oh, I did some odd things, maybe, once in a while, but other people were doing those too. This was in the 20s, and it was kind of a wild period, so that it didn't stick out, and nobody thought that I was different, nor did I. But for 10 years, let's say, I got away with it. It hadn't caught up with me. I didn't even have hangovers to speak of. And then in 1 year, the whole thing changed. The first thing that happened to me was a blackout. And we all know what a blackout is. I find that a lot of other people don't. It has to be explained to them that isn't passing out. A blackout is when you walk and talk and seem to be perfectly normal, but the next day you can't remember anything about it. And you know, for the earth people, as we call non-alcoholics back home, this is very puzzling. This is very mysterious. They don't get it at all. We all know about this. First time it happened to me, it was not long after I'd had a fall, which hadn't to do with drinking. I'd gone to a house where I'd never been before, and it was on the side of a hill. You have lots of houses like that out here. The living room was way down a flight of steps, and I missed my footing and went catapulting down the steps and landed on my head. So I figured I'd had a concussion, and I went to the doctor, and he said, yes, I had had a concussion, and it would pass, and it would be all right. It was nothing very serious. Well, the funny thing was I had another one of these blackouts, and then I had another one, and that was just the beginning. And they kept coming more often, and they covered more period of time than the evening before. And at the same time, I began to develop the kind of hangover that we all know that really ought to have a different name, because ordinary drinkers don't really mean the same thing when they say hangover. Ours are epic. We have to do something about it. We just can't function. And that was when, of course, I discovered the morning drink. Well, once that happened, I was really hooked. I had never been a periodic drinker or a weekend drinker. I had always been a daily drinker. And when this came, I was an all-day drinker. This isn't very good for your life or your work or anything else, and I was in a lovely position to get away with this because I was in the photography business, And I got very fond of the dark room. I spent a lot of time in the dark room. Boy, you could have bottles stashed all over there. Nobody ever saw them because they never put the lights on. And also you could go in there and have a drink perfectly comfortably. No matter who was outside, they didn't necessarily know it. And again, skipping over, this was a matter of 2 or 3 years at a 4th of July party. By this time, I was living in England. I'd gone over there in 1930, and I liked living over there. This was out in the country at a weekend party. And I was pretty drunk when we got there, and we had some more drinks, and I guess they thought I'd better go up and lie down for a while. I don't remember it very clearly, but I went upstairs. And I didn't come down, and they went looking for me, and I wasn't in the room. And it was some time before they found me, and I was on the terrace outside, pretty well smashed up. And no one knows to this day whether I jumped or fell. It's possible that I jumped because at that point I was talking suicide quite a lot, and that's something else that happens to many of us. This feeling that we can't go on the way it is, and we don't know what to do about it. And all this time, incidentally, I had never in my life heard the word alcoholism. I didn't know there was such a thing as an alcoholic, and I really didn't know what was happening to me. Why was it that I, who had been such a good drinker, able to manage it so beautifully, how come I wasn't anymore? What had changed? What had happened? Well, I didn't know. And after this accident, where I was pretty well smashed up and had to spend 6 months in the hospital getting over it, I started making the rounds of doctors, asking them what had happened. And this was in the 30s, and they didn't know, and they didn't tell me. Again, to telescope it, I spent 5 years, really, trying to find out what was the matter. And during those 5 years, I was constantly attempting to drink the way I used to. I think many of us make this mistake. It just doesn't occur to us, at least it didn't to me, to stop altogether. What we want is to return to the kind of drinking we did when we began and when it was fun. And we remember that fun. And we're reaching for it. We're seeking it. We remember some of the intense pleasures that we had after a few drinks. And we did. There's no doubt about it. Alcohol was magic. It made us feel good. It made us good company. We enjoyed a party. And we're looking for that and trying to find it again. Today, I think the information is much more available than it was in my day. That if you're an alcoholic, if your drinking has gone out of control, there's nothing on earth you can do to put it back in control. The only thing you can do is quit altogether. But I didn't know that. Nobody told me. And I kept trying this impossible thing with less and less success. When you're drinking like that, you know, everything goes wrong. You can't really work properly. You're not very good company. People began talking to me about my drinking. Well, I didn't like that. We never do. I was frightened at what was happening, and I was trying my best to do what I could, which wasn't achieving anything. But when people would talk to me about it, and moralistically, you know, sort of shaking the finger, why can't you drink the way you used to? Why don't you drink like so-and-so drinks? Why don't you drink like the rest of us? I didn't know why. And this would upset and disturb me, and I wouldn't want to see those people anymore. Well, I lived in London, and because of my business, I knew an awful lot of different groups in London. I had contact with different groups for different reasons. And when this happened, I would stop going around with that group and move into another one. It wasn't too difficult for me to do, and at first they were perfectly happy about it, until they got to know me a little better. In not very many months, I'd gone through London like a dose of salt. I had no more groups to move into. I'd used them all up. So at this point, I began thinking about going somewhere else. You know, the geographic cure. I had some friends that owned a hotel in the country, and they wanted to go away for the winter, and they were looking for someone that would run the hotel. Well, that was me. I went down to do this, and I was very serious about it, and I thought that, no, maybe I ought to quit drinking for a while. So I did. And an interesting thing about us is that quit drinking, yes, that we can do. But I had never done it before. And when I quit drinking, the most awful things happened. I couldn't sleep, I couldn't eat. I had the cold chills and the hot sweat, and I thought, I'm terribly sick. And I called the local doctor in this little town in the country in England, and he came over and examined me, and I'd just come down from London. And he said, you know, you've just come from London, and I think you've got some tropical disease. And you'd better stay in bed for a few days while I try to find out what this is and what we can do about it. So he put me to bed and had me on a liquid diet, lots of orange juice, and I was too sick to drink at that point, and I was trying not to anyway. And of course, in 2 or 3 days, I was just fine. He thought he was simply wonderful. He cured a tropical disease. It's amazing how anybody can be that naive and that stupid, but I was. I simply had no experience with what happened to someone who was drinking the way I was, completely out of control in immense quantities, when they suddenly stopped. I was having withdrawal symptoms and had never heard the word. Well, I stayed down there in the country for quite a while. There were 2 or 3 little things that happened that I'll share with you to just give you a picture of an alcoholic rampant. We didn't have a license in that hotel, but there was a pub right across the street, and we had a storybook butler that looked exactly like a butler ought to look. And he would take the orders from the guests and go over the other side of the street and get a tray full and bring them back. This was a quiet little country town. It was a very beautiful one, so a lot of tourists came there. Well, I don't mind telling you, it was a place called Broadway. And if any of you have been to England, you've probably seen it, because people go to look at it. It's not far from Oxford. And nothing has been built on the main street since the 16th century, and it really is very beautiful. And he would come back with these things. Well, I would ask him to get some supplies for me. And this was an old Jacobean building. They're black and white, you know, white stucco and black beams. And all the rooms downstairs had little cupboards in the walls. I don't know what they were for originally. But his orders for me were to put a pink gin, which is practically straight gin, in every cupboard. And I would then be able to go through those rooms, you know, on inspection to make sure everything was nice and clean. Go over and open the cupboard, shut the cupboard, go on my way. I did pretty well. But I had learned one thing. I didn't dare keep a bottle in my room. This not drinking at all hadn't lasted very long. You got that picture. And apart from the pub across the common, which was out the front door, there was another pub around the corner that you could reach through the orchard in the back that just served beer. I used to go in there quite a lot because I could slip out of my office and through the orchard at night and go over to the pub and have some beer and come back. And it wasn't very long before I discovered something. This was in a county called Worcestershire in England. I discovered something called old beer. Well, if you've never been to England and never had old beer, you haven't lived. Old beer is about 80 proof. So I drank old beer, and I did pretty well. This, of course, was all while I was trying to control my drinking and just drink beer and not drink much, you know. Just giving you an idea, I belong here, that's all. And there was another thing that happened. The two men that owned the place had a lot of fun experimenting with making wine. They'd made blackberry wine and raspberry wine and dandelion wine and I don't know what all. And they told everybody about this, and they bottled it all and put it in the attic to age. And as I said, I had reached the point where I had enough sense not to have a bottle in my room. It was always empty in the morning, so what was the use of having it anyway? And in the night, when things got pretty rough, I'd stagger into this attic and have one of these god-awful bottles of wine. Then I'd put the empty on the bottom and put a fresh one on top. Kind of a pyramid stack, they had these stacked up there. Well, that was about the most terrible brew I ever drank, but it did have alcohol in it. So it saved my life on many occasions. Years later, after I was in AA in New York, I went to a party one time. There at the party was one of the men that had owned that hotel. When I came in, he said, "Well, I'm glad you're alive." He said, "I thought you'd be dead by now. But tell me just one thing. Did you drink that wine?" I said, "Yes, I did." Well, he said, "Now I'm really surprised you're alive." It's that bad. It got to the point where I couldn't run the hotel or do anything else. I was past being able to function or to work. I had become convinced that I must be insane. Now, I don't think that I'm so unusual. I think an awful lot of us, when we reach that point, if we don't know the score, if we don't really know what alcoholism is, think that we are insane. We can't understand why this has happened to us, why in so many other areas we still have control, we can do what we want, we make up our mind to something, that's what we do. And in this particular area we have no control at all, and we can make up our mind and it doesn't even matter. It's frightening. The blackouts are frightening. The horrors at 3 o'clock in the morning are frightening. The fact that your life is falling apart all around you, and you don't know why, and you don't know what to do about it, this is frightening. And it's quite natural, I think, that many of us should begin to feel inside that, I used to put it, something's broken in my head, something's cracked up here. I had a feeling that if I went to a doctor and told them about this, they'd recognize pretty quickly, and that I would be locked up somewhere and I might never get out, and I was, after all, not in my own country. So I decided it would be a very good idea if I could get back to my own country. And with considerable effort, because by that time I was broke, I managed through friends of my family to get up enough money to come home. I wasn't going to drink on the boat. I was always making these decisions, not to anybody else, just to me. I wasn't going to drink on the boat. It was going to be a new life when I got back home. I was going to do this and that and the other. You know, you build these dreams about what you're going to do. Particularly if you've had a few drinks, the dreams get pretty nice and big. So I looked forward to this lovely sober trip. Of course, I had to have a few drinks before I got on the boat. And I ended being poured on the boat, and I never drew a sober breath all the way home. And when we got to New York, I'd been away for 7 years. I didn't even see the skyline. I didn't know we'd arrived. I was in the bar. I was the last person off the boat, and I was carried off the boat, just as I'd been carried on. And for the next year in New York, I was drunk all the time, with a few exceptions. Every once in a while it would get to the point where I literally couldn't drink anymore. The body wouldn't take it. And I would once again start looking for some answers and for some help. And I was so convinced by this time that I was insane that I was looking for the help in the logical place. I was going to psychiatrists. I would find out from someone I knew the name of the psychiatrist and I'd go see him. And I was so naive about this that when he asked me some questions, I would always tell him the reason I thought that I needed help was my drinking. This was in 1937. And a lot of you don't realize how dark the world was for people like us in 1937, how little anyone knew about this illness, how little the word describing it, the word alcoholism, was ever used. Not one of those doctors I went to see ever told me that I was an alcoholic. They didn't even tell me that I was the kind of person that couldn't drink anymore. They all indicated to me that I was probably right. They didn't say it, that I was insane. But the advice I got over and over again was that I had better commit myself to a state institution. Now, I didn't know a thing in the world about state institutions, but I had all the misconceptions so many people do. It was a snake pit. And once you got in, you'd never get out. And what I thought they were saying to me was that, because I'd always say for how long, and they wouldn't tell me. One of them said indefinitely. Gee, that's forever. And that's a pretty horrible thing to hear. That really puts the fear of God. So I would go out of there, and I would head for the nearest bar, and I'd order 3 or 4 doubles, and I'd get them down as fast as I could to forget what I had been told. And then I'd keep going for as long as I could until it got unbearable again, and then I'd go to another one. Well, in 1 year I saw 7. They were all honest men. They didn't any of them take me on under false pretenses or tell me they could cure me, or they really didn't know. And they indicated they didn't know. But I was reading it always as a sentence to hopeless insanity. And my fears grew worse and worse. My blackouts, incidentally, by this time sometimes lasted for a week. And I would wake up and find it was a different month. It wasn't July, it was August. I would also find names and addresses in my address book that I didn't recognize. And on a number of occasions I was warmly greeted on the street by people I'd never seen before, because I apparently got around in my blackout. I know I broke 5 pairs of glasses that last summer, and it was from falling down areaways, which I apparently did quite regularly. But you know, that's a living death, really. You are afraid all the time. You're sick all the time. But you aren't drunk all the time because you can't be. Your body won't allow it. After a certain point, you just can't hold anymore. Well, there's even another point that happens all the time, and that is that you go to sleep or you pass out, and you wake up, usually at 3 o'clock in the morning, with a fairly clear head. You have a picture of what's happened. You know what you're becoming. I hated what I was becoming. But I didn't have the faintest idea what to do with it. I didn't know where else to turn. Well, I was fortunate because some friends of mine, for a Christmas present, sent me to the 8th psychiatrist that I'd been with. And he was different. Not that he knew any more about it than the others. I think he really did. But he didn't use those terms that we are all so familiar with today. He was the first one that began talking about people like you. I was to hear a lot of that in the next year. People like you. And he told me people like you can't drink. but you're going to need some help. And I told him that I couldn't not drink, that I needed to be in a hospital, and he agreed with me. And he put me in a hospital. Now, I was broke. I didn't have any money. I couldn't go to an expensive sanitarium. And he asked me if I would go to Bellevue. Now, those of you who know New York know that Bellevue is our city hospital. It's not a very pretty place. They're trying to pretty it up these days, but it wasn't then. And he assured me that I was not insane. He said, I'm not going to put you in the psychiatric section. You don't belong there. He was also a neurologist. I'm going to put you in the neurology ward. He said, I'm the head of the neurology department down there. I can see you regularly and look after you, and we'll see how things go. He didn't give me any hope, but I was happy to go somewhere where I felt safe, and I went there. I was there for 7 months. And physically, I got better, obviously. I couldn't drink. They take your clothes away when you go to Bellevue, and you can't get out. I was in a big ward. Most of the people there had neurological problems, paralysis, tumors, that kind of thing. There were a couple of women there, I remember, who were paralyzed from the waist down. And they had had what used to be called alcoholic, what was it? They call it polyneuropathy now. They call it a different name, but they called it alcoholic. That's the first time I'd ever heard that word. That whatever had happened to them, it had to do with drinking, and that frightened me quite a bit because they were shipped off to the hospital for incurable. They were never going to walk again. Even so, my doctor did not talk to me about alcoholism on the times that I spoke with him, and I felt more and more that I had to have more help than that for what I still believe to be an insanity. And of course, in the second step, we acknowledge that, don't we? Restore me to sanity. And I did have my finger on something, and I knew also, and I don't know how I knew, that while I could get better and feel pretty well and obviously not drink when I couldn't get it in the hospital, that if I went out, I couldn't guarantee for a minute what I would do or what I would not do, or whether I would drink or whether I would not drink. And so I kept insisting to my doctor that I had to have psychiatric treatment, that I had to have treatment for whatever had changed in me that had made this happen. And eventually I got it, and he got me into a private institution where I had psychiatric treatment every day. And I liked my doctor. And he told me in no uncertain terms that people like you, because he didn't use the word alcoholic, cannot drink at all. Well, this should have been a real answer to me. It should have explained a lot, and it should have made me feel better, but it didn't. Because I couldn't conceive of a life without drinking. And I think that's true of many of us when we first come for help here. If AA could tell us that if we did thus and so, we would be able to drink 2 or 3 drinks and not get in trouble, this would be the answer to our prayer. But when we find out that the only answer for us is never to drink again, we look ahead at a long gray waste, flat, dull, no trees, no rocks, nothing, a desert. Just one little simple thing that I used to argue with the doctor. I said, look, I don't like people who don't drink. And I never did. Teetotalers, you know, those good gray faces and that lovely white teeth they have, they weren't my kind of people. Everyone I knew drank. What was I going to do? How was I going to live if I didn't drink? I couldn't figure it. Besides, I discovered something else in that sanitarium, that he was the only doctor that was telling his patients that. I found some other people up there, their doctors were going to teach them how to drink normally. And I figured I had the wrong doctor. I asked him point blank one day, I said, "Do you drink?" "Well, yes," he said, "I don't like it much." I thought, he doesn't want anybody else to drink. Spoiled for it. Do you know, at that time, an awful lot of doctors were doing that. They felt that treating an alcoholic was to treat them to drink normally, and they had not waked up to the fact that this just never worked. I had been there for almost a year, and I have to admit that I learned a great deal from that doctor and from my treatment. I learned about a lot of things that had always troubled me. I learned a lot of things about myself. I think I became a far more integrated person, but nothing changed about my drinking, and by this time I was free to go into town when I wanted to, into New York, to the dentist or to a theater. And I would go in 8 or 9 times and come back perfectly all right. The 10th time I'd come back drunk. What I was doing was testing it out. I'm getting so much better. Now I ought to be able to drink. Every time I did, I went overboard. And after this had happened a half a dozen times, I think the people up there had had about enough of it. My doctor said, "If this happens again, you're going to have to go." Well, here again, the alcoholic is not like other people. This was my last chance. I had looked for help for a long while, and I had gotten what I had so eagerly sought that I felt I needed. And you would have thought that the threat of losing it would have kept me from drinking, but that isn't what happened. I just took a lot more care and came in the back way, and I knew everybody up there and got some of the nurses, if I came back a little loaded, to smuggle me into bed right away and get me some black coffee and cover up. And things had arrived at this pass, and it was obvious that they were going to throw me out pretty soon, when my doctor sent for me one day, and he was at home sick. And I thought, oh, this is it, he's going to tell me the worst, I have to go. And I had nowhere to go. If I'd been thrown out of there at that time, I think I would have been dead in a very short time. But that wasn't what he wanted me for. He had a book on his lap. Not an ordinary book. It was this size with red covers, and it was multilith, if you know what that is. Typed and then reproduced. And he said, "I've been reading this." He said, "This book is written by people like you, and they seem to have found an answer. And I think maybe it'll help you, and I want you to read it." And he handed it to me, and the title was Alcoholics Anonymous. And I took it, went back to the sanitarium and to my room, and I started to read. And there, for the first time, I began to see myself in print. I recognized myself pretty soon. I'm different from a lot of people who cite the word alcoholic and the word alcoholism, don't like it, don't want to apply it to themselves. I was pretty tired of being people like you, having something unknown, and I was pretty scared of having something unknown, too. Because in this institution, it was big, it was 500 acres, beautiful place in the country, and when you came in the gate, there was a great big old mansion right at the gate, and that's where the doctor's offices were, and that upstairs were the rooms where people spent the last few days or weeks of their stay there. It was the graduate house. Further along, you came to the house where they arrived, very often in a straitjacket, and where they were kept until they were able to move into the middle house, where practically everybody was, where I had been for this whole year. Hidden away at the other end of the golf course, there was a little place that they bought them when they were violent, screaming. And we had to walk by there going on the way to the pottery, where we did pottery work. We could hear this. And a lot of people were brought there and such. This was not just for alcoholics, you understand. There were all kinds of mental illnesses in this hospital. But people were brought there really in very, very bad shape. And yet after a while, they would come out of this little house and they would come up to the middle house where I was. And after a while, they'd go to the graduate house for the gates and they'd go home. But I stayed on and on and on. And this began to make me question whether I'd ever get out or whether I would ever get well. These things, I think now, looking back on it, had produced a climate in me, a readiness for what I was beginning to read in this book. But more than anything else, I read with the greatest relief in the world that there was something called alcoholism, that it was a disease. People who had it were called alcoholics. And everything was going fine until I began to trip over the capital letters. And all of a sudden, it seemed to me they had God about 20 times on every page. And this was not for me. I had outgrown that at 17. I didn't want to go back to any of that kid stuff. I was very arrogant about it. And I thought, well, this is fine, and I'm awfully glad for them, but I can't follow this path. And I began telling the doctor this. And all he would say was, well, you just keep reading the book. I'd read just enough in the book so that I could give him a good argument about how bad it was on every occasion that I met with him. By that time, it was 2 or 3 times a week only. And then I would stop reading it because I didn't like it. And this went on for some weeks. I was resisting that book and what I was reading in it with everything in me. You know, it says in the book that the alcoholic will not come to our way of living, an acceptance of the 12 steps, until he's had a crisis. And it even suggests that sometimes we can hurry that crisis up when we're trying to help someone. Well, there wasn't anybody there to hurry it up, but nevertheless, a crisis occurred in my life. It was something over which I had no control, but where I felt to blame, because it wouldn't have happened if I hadn't been where I was. And it was something that happened to my sister, and I felt guilty about it, and helpless to do anything about it, and in such a rage that I couldn't do anything, that I was lying in my room, and I literally saw red. I'd never known that was true before, but it is. You get angry enough, you see red. And I wanted to kill someone. Well, I reacted just as we all do in a situation like that. I thought, I'll walk downtown and I'll get 2 bottles, and I'll get so drunk I'll bust this place up, I'll show them. And that is a perfect example of the great intelligence of the alcoholic. When we get angry enough at someone else, our immediate reaction is to pick up a hammer and bash our own heads in. Because that's what that would have been. But before I could do it, I'd been reading this damn book, lying open on the bed, and out of the corner of my eye, I saw this page, which was, I wasn't reading it really, it was kind of blurred. And in the middle of the page there was a line that stood out as if it had been carved in sharp black. And it read, "We cannot live with anger." And that did it. I have no idea why. But the next thing I knew, I was on my knees beside that bed, and there was a big wet spot on the bedspread, and I guess I'd been there quite a while. And possibly I was praying if I knew the words to say anymore. But I lifted my head, and there's no way of describing this feeling, really, except to say that I knew I was free. I had been freed. You could say that there was the presence of God in the room. I don't know how you want to say it. It was a most extraordinary feeling, a most wonderful feeling. I was up on the third floor. I was in a little room under the eaves, and the window wasn't very big, which I guess was pretty fortunate, because I knew I could walk out that window and keep walking. And then I thought about it, and I thought, well, now I really am insane, and I better go down and tell the doctor about it. And I did. And he questioned me very, very closely. And when he had finished, he said, "I don't think you're insane." He said, "I think you've had an authentic spiritual experience. And apparently many people have had these. There's a book called Varieties of Religious Experience by William James. Get it and read it. But before you do that, go back upstairs and read that book." And I did. I went back upstairs and I started to read the book, and it was a totally different book. I wasn't resisting it at all. I began at the beginning and I read it through at a sitting. And when I finished it, I started to read it again. It was the most wonderful book I had ever read. And incidentally, the grass was greener than I'd ever seen it. And the sky was bluer. And all the people around there looked perfectly beautiful. And this pink cloud of mine lasted for weeks, where the world was that beautiful, and people were that beautiful, and everything was right. Well, of course, I didn't want to go and meet the people that this book had been written by and about, because that might have spoiled my pink cloud. So I was in resistance again. I wouldn't go into New York and meet these people, and I managed to put it off for about 6 weeks. And finally, my doctor picked up the phone and called, and he said, "She'll be in tonight." And he said, "You go to this and this address. You'll be there at 7 o'clock. And I went. And I met 3 delightful people, a husband and wife, and they had another man for me. Not only that, he was the handsomest guy I'd ever seen. Real black Irishman, you know. We got a lot of those in AA. And I found no difficulty at all in talking with them. And they were strangers. This had never happened to me before. Well, we left after dinner to go to this meeting. We went in the subway over to Brooklyn, and I got more and more frightened. And we arrived at an old brownstone house in Brooklyn. And I went upstairs to leave my coat, and I didn't come down. I'd looked in that living room, and it was just crammed with people. Must have been 35 or 40 of them. And remember that I had taken to alcohol so happily because I was afraid of people. I was uncomfortable with people I didn't know particularly. I didn't mix easily unless I'd had some drinks. And here I was walking into a strange house in the company of 3 strangers, and I was going to meet 30 or 40 more strangers, and I was terrified. And a woman came up and put her arm around me and said, "You know, we're waiting for you down there, and we want you down there." Her name was Lois. And she led me downstairs, and everybody came up and began talking, and of course the first thing somebody said to me was, "When did you have your last drink?" And to my own amazement, automatically, without thinking about it, I told the truth. I found myself talking to these people. There were a lot of wives there, not a lot, but quite a few, but they were mostly men. All the members of AA were men. I found myself talking to them in a way I had never talked to anybody. So easily, so comfortably, so intimately, so honestly. It was as if I could finish their sentences and they could finish mine. I had discovered the first great thing that a new person finds, the fellowship that you find in AA, the acceptance, the ability to communicate with each other, the understanding we have one for the other. I discovered that night. And it was one of the most wonderful things that ever happened. And you know, still to this day, I think that the fellowship we have and the way we feel about each other and the way we can talk with each other is one of the great things about AA. It isn't the whole thing. I learned that later. And if that's all you've got, you haven't got it. Because that won't sustain you in bad times enough. But it remains one of the great things we have, and it's a curious and interesting thing that we are able to communicate with each other at a level that most people never reach. You stop and think of it. Most people talk to each other in a pretty surface way. It's a lot of small talk. They don't particularly, in fact, they hardly ever tell other people how they really feel or what they really think. They wouldn't dare. They'd get hit in the face. Most people in this world don't dare be truly honest with each other or truly open with each other. It's a very sad thing. But we here can and do. We talk to each other with no holds barred, with no frills, with no pretense. We really communicate. We communicate what's in our hearts, what's on our minds. And this is a fellowship that I think many non-alcoholics would give an awful lot to have. It's a great thing that we've got. And that night I discovered this for the first time. Back up in the sanitarium, there was a man, also an alcoholic, whom I knew very well, and I had passed the book on to him as soon as I'd finished it, and he had read it, and he had liked it. He didn't even fight it the way I did. So when the doctor told me I had to go in town, I went to him and I said, "Come on, you come too." He said, "Oh no, you go and tell me what it's like." And he was just as scared to meet these people as I'd been. So I'd gone alone, but the next morning, I'd stayed overnight in town. He called up and he said, "What was it like?" And I said, "Well, Granny, we're not alone anymore." And that was the main and the first thing that I discovered about AA. I was not alone anymore. I had found my people. I had come home. I was where I belonged. And I felt that I belonged. And this was a very great thing. For a long while, that was almost all I needed. Oh, yes, I was looking at the 12 steps and thinking about them. But I wasn't doing very much about them. I was living on the fellowship, and we only had one meeting a week. It was on a Tuesday night. Tuesday night's still my meeting week. I go to a meeting every Tuesday night. That's when my group meets in New York, when I'm home. And I can do that out here, too. I go to a Tuesday night meeting. But only one meeting a week. That's all there was in New York City. And people came to that meeting from Connecticut and New Jersey and Long Island There wasn't any other. And it was a long time between Tuesdays. You sort of lived on it for 2 or 3 days, and then you got through the other days in anticipation of the next one. We needed more than that. But even so, that meant so much to me, and that was something so new in my life that I was able to sort of survive on it for quite a while. I think I might have gone on much longer if I hadn't got in trouble. But because that was all that I was doing, because I wasn't really working hard for 12 steps, I think I felt let off a lot of them because I'd been through all this psychiatric treatment, so that had done it for me. I didn't have to do it. And that's not so. And after 8 months, I had a slip. A really bad one. I landed in Bellevue again, but this time not in the neurological ward, which is very nice. I landed in the alcoholic ward they had at that time, and it wasn't very nice. It was a miserable time. And when I came out of that, I had to figure out what it was that I hadn't done or what it was that I had done. And I sat and looked at the other people at meetings, and I wondered what they had that I didn't have. And I knew they must be right. They were sober. And the first thing I discovered was the 24-hour plan, which I had not been thinking much about because I was already sober when I came in. I'd been in the hospital quite a while. And I began to operate that 24-hour plan. And then I began to take the steps very seriously and try to practice them as best I could, one after the other. And that, I think, is when I began to get the real benefit of AA and begin to understand it. Looking back now, I know that that was when I began to embark on a program of growth, just like that 5th chapter you heard read, spiritual growth. You see, I had accepted God after that startling and wonderful experience. I believed. But I hadn't started to make use of my beliefs. I hadn't started to put my new faith to work. And I hadn't really started to work on me. And the way I look at it now, those 12 steps are really not about drinking. Sometimes I like to say that we got here under false pretenses. We came to AA to do something about our drinking. And they hand us the 12 steps and read them. They're not about drinking. Only the first one mentions alcohol. All the rest are about you and me. What kind of a person are you? What are you like inside? Do you know what you're like? Have you ever taken an honest, deep look at yourself? Do you know what your assets are? Do you know what your liabilities are? Are you willing to give up your liabilities and to have them removed? Are you willing to change? It seems to me that all of our lives, particularly the drinking part of it, we have been very busy putting our worst foot forward. That the alcohol we were drinking was really like watering the weeds in our garden. We hadn't really made an effort to develop the very best part of ourselves. We hadn't even taken a good look at what was the best part of ourselves. And now here for the first time for most of us, it was for me, I found that I had to begin to take a really honest look at me. What made me tick? What was good about me and what was not so good? And what was I going to do about the part that was not so good? And I really began to try to use those 12 steps. Well, my friends, I embarked on a lifelong project. I'm still doing it. And that was 29 years ago. And it isn't a grim project. I am very happy that I'm still doing it. It's given meaning to my life. Working on those steps has helped me through every kind of problem you could think of. Those steps are tools which, if we will pick them up and use them, will enable us to lead a pretty good life no matter what's going on around us. Because we can learn to be inwardly comfortable. That's what they do for you. Once you really can face yourself as you are, once you can take stock of yourself, your good and your bad, and begin to make a real effort to promote the good side and get rid of the bad as best you can, or at least stamp it down, you begin to feel comfortable. You can look yourself square in the eye in the mirror in the morning and not flinch. You can be alone with yourself and not have to run away from it. You can be comfortable inside. Things aren't always good. Troubles occur, tragedies occur, difficulties beset us. But we have become different enough inside so that we can bend with the punches. We're not rigid anymore. An unfortunate occurrence doesn't knock us flat on our face. We can take it. And we've been given a lot of tools with which we meet it. Our serenity prayer, for instance. That'll meet almost any situation if you really think about it. And some of the little slogans that we've developed for ourselves. First things first. And easy does it. And live and let live. And let go and let God. You know, these sound to outsiders kind of corny. Maybe a little stupid even. But they're not. Every one of them, if you really think about it, is a profound piece of advice that can be very helpful to you at a moment when you may desperately need it. What we're dealing with here is not just something in a textbook that you read once and forget about it. They're tools which, if you use them, you can learn how to live. You can learn how to meet life and all of its difficulties and all of its problems and stay upright. It's my opinion, and this is merely my opinion, that it takes us, particularly if we've had a long, bad drinking history as I'd had, it takes us some years to achieve this comfort I'm talking about, this equilibrium, this balance, to be able to become flexible and take what life gives us and not be thrown by it. We don't achieve it overnight. It took us a long while to get to the point where we had to come to AA. We weren't very many of us instant alcoholics. We worked at it for quite a long while. And we're not going to get over it instant. We're going to have to work at that quite a long while. Well, frankly, working at yourself and your own growth as a human being is a lifetime proposition. And the interesting thing about it is that your goals change as you go along. As you begin to approach some of them, you find that you've got others beyond them that you want to reach. And I don't mean that these are unrealistic or things you can never reach. I think most of us want a lot of the same things. We want to be a decent person. We want to be an honest person. We want to be the kind of person that other people want to be around and want to have around. We want to be liked. You know, we're not unusual. We're not different. Everybody wants that. But we found a way in which we can make ourselves likable. If there are things about it that aren't likable, we're going to find them if we're really looking at ourselves, and we're going to try to do something about it. Because that's growth, and that's what AA is. In this growth, this program of growing that I entered on a long while ago, and which I feel will not end for me as long as I'm alive, I hope, I have found that I cannot do it all alone. I need the kind of thing that I found that first night. I need the fellowship and the understanding and the acceptance of other people like myself who are doing the same thing. And I find that most easily at meetings. This is where we go to find each other in numbers. And I have found, after 29 years, that I need a meeting at least once a week. Sometimes I have to skip one. If I'm traveling and I'm too busy every night because I'm myself talking about alcoholism to non-alcoholics. But I think that we're going to need each other in this way, at this level, as long as we live. And I don't think that's anything to feel badly about. I think we're so fortunate we have each other. Think back. Think back at what it was like when you were an active alcoholic. Those of you that have been sober for a while. Think of the loneliness. There isn't a lonelier illness or disease in the world. We were so walled off from other people. We were so walled off from love and affection. We were so walled off from any kind of understanding. I used to describe it to my psychiatrist as being in a glass box when I was trying to tell him how I felt. That I was in a glass box. I could hear and I could see, but I couldn't feel. I couldn't touch anything and nothing could touch me. I was cut off. And it's the loneliest thing in the world. This is what we came from. We came out of that loneliness. And look what we came into. Warmth, friendship, acceptance, helpfulness, thoughtfulness, the things that we try to show each other. We who are considered to be so egocentric, so self-centered, so selfish. And I guess that's what our alcoholism made us, or that's how we appeared to other people. And instead of that, we are people who, by and large, will go the last mile for each other. We'll reach out our hand to help someone if they show any signs of wanting it, at any time, in any place, under any conditions. That's changed. That's different from the way we were. And we learned that here. We learned that in AA. We learned it from each other. We learned it at meetings. Wouldn't it be foolish, after any number of years, however many years, if I had all that at my fingertips, just by going to a certain address on a certain night at a certain time, and I didn't do it? Who would I be hurting? No one but me. I'd be the one that was cutting myself off. Well, these are some of the thoughts that I have about AA. And I feel also, and I know a lot about alcoholism professionally, it's my business to know about it. The more I learn about it, the more frightening it becomes, let me tell you. This is a fearful disease we've got. And not enough is known about it, really. And we have been fortunate enough to find a way out of it. But you and I know that we haven't eliminated it out of ourselves. It's still there. We don't get up here and say, I was an alcoholic, do we? We say, I am an alcoholic. We used to have a saying years ago in AA. In talking to someone who was still drinking. You know, the only difference between you and me is one drink. If you don't take it, you can be like me. If I do take it, I'll be like you. One drink. That's all we need to start down that spiral into that lonely glass box again. And it is baffling and cunning, and it does come back. And when you have a lot of problems over a period of time, a lot of stress and strain, a lot of crisis in your life, and all of us do, one way or another, what is going to sustain you against taking that one drink? With its instant relief that we remember so well. Instant but temporary relief. The thing that's going to sustain us is what we have here. The thing that's going to sustain us is having that very, very clear in our minds that that is not the answer. One of my favorite little statements is that there's nothing so bad that a drink won't make it worse. And there have been days when I've had to say that over to myself many times. No, what I'm trying to tell you is that we have been given a great, great gift. We are the most fortunate of people. We have found a way out of that morass. We've broken out of that glass box. And we found fellowship and friendship and love and understanding and concern for us. And we found that we could give all those things, that we could feel concern for others and love for others. We've rejoined the human race. We have become whole. But I think we have to remember that we have to keep doing this. That it isn't something we can just put away in a pocket and forget how we got it. We have to keep growing. Nothing in nature stands still. There's no such thing. You're either moving ahead or you're going back. And if you don't keep moving ahead and growing, you're going to go backwards. Backwards where you came from. And that's something that I, for one, don't want. And some of the things I know I have to do to keep that from happening is not just keep up my contact with AA. I want that, I need it, I love it. But remember and act on some of the things I have learned in AA. Alcoholics are known, for instance, as irresponsible people. And while we're drinking, God knows we are irresponsible. We don't take responsibility for anything, including our own actions. And when we get sober and start to live again, we have begun, just by doing that, to be responsible for our own actions. But I go a step further. We have been freely given a great gift. And we know that we are able to give that gift to others. We are very able to help other alcoholics. And I think we're responsible for that. I don't think that we can shirk it, forget about it, or not do it. We've been given this gift, which is a remarkable and wonderful thing, and we have to use it. So we take responsibility for ourselves first, and then we take responsibility for helping other alcoholics who need and want our help. And finally, we take all the responsibilities of an adult human being, a man or a woman, for our lives, and our families, and our friends. And then we have begun really to grow up. And then we find that there's a great satisfaction in this, that it makes us feel good. Because at long last we have finally become the kind of person we wanted to be. I think all of us, when we were growing up, had a picture of what we wanted to be like. And God knows the drunken us didn't match that picture very well. But we find when we get sober and when we begin to work at it that we gradually become closer, at least, to the image that we once had of the kind of person we want to be. Not only do we find our self-respect, we find that other people respect us. Not only do we approve of ourselves at last, but other people approve of us. Other people want us around and want to see us. We are valuable. We are liked. Well, this is a pretty great thing for us. A lot of people I know have it without trying, who aren't alcoholics, but for us, coming from where we have been, this is a very great thing. And this happened to us because of AA. This is where we learned it. And this is where we have an opportunity to give it away. And we, more than anyone else, should know how true that statement was. You have to give it away to keep it. If I sound like an orthodox AA, I am. I think that's the best kind. I think the things that have been learned about what you have to do to stay sober, and not just to stay sober, but to enjoy your sobriety. We used to have a saying around New York that it isn't the length of time that counts, it's the quality of your sobriety that counts. And it's the quality of sobriety that makes you happy, that makes you comfortable, that makes you able to enjoy life. And if you want that quality, then you have to keep working at it every day. You don't get it once and put it away in the drawer and forget about it. You'll be right back flat on your face again if that's what you do. I've had a wonderful time here. I've seen so many of my AA friends, and I love getting out here and seeing them. And I've enjoyed being here with you. I've just been thinking out loud to you, talking about some of the things that are close to my heart and that I think about a lot, and trying to share with you some of the feelings I have that I think have helped me to stay sober, and I hope will help me to stay sober for a long while to come. And there are things you hear all the time, but I don't think it'll hurt your having heard them again. I hope not. And anyway, thank you for letting me be here. I have gained a lot from it.